Hi there. In this video I'm going to tell you about a mistake that you might well be frequently making in the composition of your assessed work at degree level. I'm going to explain how this mistake can repeatedly undermine your attainment. I'm then going to tell you about a simple method that you can use to help you understand exactly what's expected of you, allow you to evaluate your work more accurately, and therefore reliably get the kind of grades that you want. Research indicates that students often lack a sound understanding of what the expectations of a particular assessment are. And not surprisingly, that same body of research also indicates that the bigger the discrepancy between student and tutor expectations for a particular assessment, the worse the mark the student obtains for that assessment tends to be. Let me illustrate this by asking you a question. What's the first thing that you reach for when you're preparing to tackle one of your written assignments? Hopefully you didn't say, well, I just Google it. But in all seriousness, if you said anything other than the marking and the grading criteria for that assessment, then there's a very good chance that you don't fully understand the requirements of that assessment and will likely underperform. Rushing to begin an assessment without first properly interrogating the marking and grading criteria is a big mistake, because understanding the marking and grading criteria is key to understanding what's expected of you in terms of that particular assessment. You can think of marking and grading criteria as being something like a person specification when you're applying for a job. And in the same way that you wouldn't just attend a job interview having not read the person specification, you shouldn't start on a piece of assessed work without first having read and understood the marking and grading criteria. Let's expand on what we mean by the terms marking and grading criteria, because sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, but they actually refer to slightly different information, which is often presented in tandem. Marking criteria refers to the dimensions against which your work will be assessed. So for example, if you were doing an essay-based assessment, you might find a couple of the criteria against which your work will be assessed were things like the relevancy of your composition, how well you've structured your work, and so on. Grading criteria, on the other hand, are the levels of attainment that are expected in relation to each of those marking criteria to achieve a certain mark, for example a first class pass or a 2-1. Here's a very small extract from a marking and grading criteria for an essay type assessment. On the left hand side of the table you can see the marking criteria in question here is that of relevancy. And on the right hand side of the table you can see a characterisation of the level of performance that will be required in order to get a first class pass with respect to the relevancy criterion. Full marking and grading criteria will often take the form of a grid. Each row of the grid will represent a different marking criteria. So our example of the marking criterion of relevancy might also be joined by rows containing things like quality of composition, use of evidence, academic integrity, and so on and so forth. The columns in the marking and grading criteria grid will each contain a characterisation of the level of attainment that is required to achieve a particular level of pass with respect to each of the marking criteria. Obtaining the marking and grading criteria for an assessed piece of work is an obviously vital first step. But knowing how your work is going to be assessed and being able to use this information to develop your work such that it will get the mark you want it to achieve are not the same things. To illustrate this, let's revisit the marking and grading criteria we've just had on the screen, which characterises a first class piece of work with respect to the relevancy criterion. Hopefully, the extract from the marking and grading criteria of an essay that appears on screen will seem entirely straightforward and reasonable to you, irrespective of what degree subject you happen to be studying. If you do think you understand the above extract from a marking and grading criteria, then I've got 3 questions for you. First of all, would you recognise an essay that met the above criterion, i.e. an essay where, in terms of its relevancy, the content was highly relevant to the topic set and was being used convincingly to address the specific essay title? Secondly, would you be able to use that essay and compare it
to your own work in order to reach some kind of judgment about how well you were doing with respect to the marking criterion of relevancy. Finally, having made this comparison, could you use this comparison in order to improve the attainment on display in your own work with respect to the marking criterion of relevancy? This isn't as straightforward as you might think. What I'm not asking is whether you could copy elements of that exemplar essay into your own work to improve your attainment with respect to relevancy, but rather whether you could spot the principles of good practice on display in the exemplar essay and emulate those principles of good practice in order to improve your own essay. If you didn't say yes to these three questions, then I would argue that you don't understand the marking and grading criteria extract well enough, such that you could use it to evaluate and improve your own work.
So, how do you develop your ability to use marking and grading criteria to evaluate and improve your own work? Well, one really good way you can do this is to practice applying that marking and grading criteria to exemplars of work that have been provided by your tutors. In terms of how you do this, what you need to remember is that the objective of the exercise is to develop an understanding of what constitutes good practice, i.e. the practice that's likely to get you the best marks in relation to each of the marking criteria. Therefore, what I'd suggest you do is evaluate an exemplar piece of work with respect to each of the criteria in turn. For each of the criteria, ask yourselves the following three questions. First, what is it about this particular exemplar of work that constitutes good practice with respect to this particular marking criterion? Being able to provide a response to this question will help you develop your understanding of what an example of good performance with respect to this particular marking criterion looks like. Second, how does what I'm doing to satisfy this particular marking criterion in the work that I'm currently developing differ from what's on display in the exemplar piece of work? Answering this question will help you understand the difference or the gap between your current level of attainment with respect to that particular marking criterion and the desired level of attainment. After all, you have to be able to identify shortcomings in your work to be able to do anything about them. Third, how can I use the principles of good performance that are on display in the exemplar piece of work that I'm looking at to improve my own composition with respect to that particular marking criterion? This is really important because having identified a shortcoming in your work, you need to be able to formulate a plan based on what you can see in the exemplar piece of work on how you can go about improving your own composition. In responding to these three questions, try and use specific instances from the exemplar work and from the draft of your own work. So, for example, if you've identified that your work is not really meeting the relevancy criterion particularly well, point to a specific instance in your work where this is the case. Equally, you should also be able to point to a specific instance in the exemplar work which illustrates to you what you could be doing better to meet that particular criterion. There are a few things to bear in mind when you're using exemplars. The first thing is that there is no need for the exemplar to address the same topic as the piece of work that you're currently engaged with. The exemplar simply needs to be an example of the same type of assessment and use the same marking and grading criteria. Remember, the purpose here is to allow you to internalise principles of good practice when it comes to composing a particular type of assessment, for example an essay, not simply show you how to compose a specific instance of that assessment, for example a very specific one-off essay question. Second, in terms of the standard of work being modelled by an exemplar, it's better to start off with exemplars that constitute excellent examples of that particular assessment type. Research suggests that students find excellent exemplars more useful in the development of their own work than exemplars that showcase perhaps mediocre or weak work. Choosing an exemplar that represents a level of attainment that you aspire to helps identify shortcomings in your own composition, and models good practice for you in remedying those shortcomings. Third, in terms of when you use an exemplar, it's probably better to compose a draft of your work before you look at the exemplar. This is especially true if the exemplar happens to address the same topic as the piece of work that you're working on. This negates the tendency to copy an exemplar of a high quality piece of work rather than use that exemplar to learn about the principles of good practice that it illustrates with respect to the marking and grading criteria for that assessment type. Finally, it's a good idea to seek some advice and guidance from tutors when it comes to the application of marking and grading criteria and the use of exemplars in evaluating your own work. Research indicates that a dialogue between students and tutors can really enhance the effectiveness of using exemplars in learning about marking and grading criteria. In talking to a tutor about a particular exemplar and its relationship to your own work, focus not on just whether you've recognised the principles of good practice being illustrated by that exemplar, but also on whether you've been able to emulate those principles of good practice in the composition of your own work. I hope you found this video helpful. If so, please do hit the like button. If you're interested in how psychology can help you study more effectively and you haven't done so already, then please do subscribe to my channel and turn on the bell notification icon so you know when I post new content. Thanks very much.